everybody, and welcome. It really is a huge pleasure for me to introduce you today to Professor Nancy Tomes, Distinguished Professor of History at Stony Brook University. And she's going to deliver the annual lecture of the university's Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare. Now, Professor Tomes's work investigates the intersection between expert knowledge and popular understandings of the body and disease. She's the author of 4 frankly outstanding books, including The Gospel of Germs, Men, Women, and the Microbe in American Life, which was winner of both the American Association for the History of Medicine's Welsh Medal and the History of Science Society's Davis Prize. And another great book, Remaking the American Patient, How Madison Avenue and Modern Medicine Turned Patients into Consumers, which was winner of the 2017 very prestigious Bancroft Prize. In 2011, Professor Tomes also received the American Public Health Association's Arthur Viseltier Award for her distinguished body of scholarship in the history of public health. Professor Tomes challenges our prevailing assumptions. She illuminates with her observations, and I highly recommend her lecture, which is on video, called Confessions of a Failed Pandemic Planner, Why It's Hard to Learn from History, in which she explains why, in the light of past epidemics and the current COVID-19 pandemic, the problems we face today in pandemic control are rooted in health systems and trust issues that have been around for some time. She says she doesn't have a crystal ball, but I'm not so sure of that. I think she's got one hidden away. So please do welcome Professor Tomes to deliver her lecture entitled Managing the Modern Infodemic, How the New Social Media Are Complicating Old Public Health Problems.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this annual lecture and to be part of a centenary celebration, I think, for the Institute for Historical Research. It's all exciting. We wish I could be there in person to blow out the candles or whatever you do at a centenary, but I'm grateful that we can connect over Zoom and that I can share with you some of my new work on the history of the modern infodemic. I think you would agree with me that among the most distressing aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic has been the damage done by the easy circulation of false and misleading information. We are facing a pandemic of poppycock, as one psychologist recently referred to it, and it has been deeply disheartening. When I talk to colleagues in academic medicine, public health, and the sciences, they are bewildered by the pushback against measures designed to halt the spread of this deadly disease. How can it be, they ask, in the midst of such scientifically vetted evidence-based recommendations, not to mention the wonders of the mRNA vaccine, that so many citizens and voters in supposedly developed countries apparently believe the most jaw-dropping nonsense? And I'll just mention in the United States, the current fad for people refusing to get COVID vaccinations to clamor for ivermectin, a drug to treat horse parasites. I too am very disheartened by all of this, but I am not surprised, as the introduction suggests. For decades, expert voices within public health and the social sciences have tried to call out problems, not only with scientific risk communication, but also trust in science itself. And those voices have largely been ignored. I hope more attention is paid this time around, and my work has one little effort in that direction. Where has this pandemic of poppycock come from? Well, the easiest explanation is the one you are most likely to hear, and that it's the social media's fault. The COVID-19 pandemic is the most serious global public health crisis to occur since the spread of personal digital devices, now used by roughly 59% of the world's population. And public health leaders often link their inability to slow COVID spread to this heightened degree of unfiltered connectivity, which has enabled this rapid sharing of false and misleading information. I'm here today to suggest that that's oversimplistic. I completely agree that social media has been a game changer, but that game was already underway before Facebook. Misinformation, epidemics, and media revolutions have historically gone hand in hand. We have to go beyond a simplistic habit of blaming the media or even scientific illiteracy and take a long, hard look at the ways we do science, communicate the results, and play politics with science. I offer this critical perspective with some trepidation. Rarely do historians get called out in times of crisis, and there's probably a good reason for that. But an opportunity has been opened up to me that has been transformative. Someone from WHO's EU division heard me give a very early version of this talk last spring and invited me to write a scoping review on the history of the concept of the infodemic. And so for the last 6 months, I've been working with my wonderful colleague Manon Perry from the University of Amsterdam on writing a health evidence network report on the concept of the infodemic. This work has given me the privilege of talking to the WHO staffers, trying to write guidance for their member nations on how to combat COVID misinformation. And you're giving me an opportunity today to try out some of our findings and some of the directions we're going in that work. Among English speakers, the word infodemic, which is a word blend of information plus epidemic, has become widely used just in the past year and a half to describe the torrent of confusing, misleading, and sometimes downright crazy information about COVID circulating on social media. As Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the WHO, noted in February 2020, we are not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic in the form of fake news that spreads faster and more easily than this virus. The WHO now defines an infodemic as, quote, an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, occurring during an epidemic. There is, in fact, so much information that the more reliable bits get diluted by the unreliable bits. Since 2020, the study of infodemics or infodemiology has become a booming academic industry, producing its own avalanche of data and recommendations. The term infodemiology was in fact coined in 2002 by the physician IT specialist Gunther Eisenbach. And the term infodemics was coined in 2003 by the political scientist David Rothkopf to describe the SARS pandemic. From its first use, this term infodemic connected the growing threat of emerging infectious diseases with the growth of the information highway. And that makes it a great concept to think historically and comparatively about two types of virality. First, the microbiological kind, that is, the ability of novel viruses to spread quickly around an interconnected world. And second, the impact of an increasingly complex network of personal electronic devices, laptops, cell phones, et cetera, that allow those billions of people to access and interact with resources available on the World Wide Web, also known as the internet. Historians, including me, realize that this doubly networked world is a significant historical phenomena. But we are hardwired, sorry for the pun, to resist overly simplistic, deterministic explanations of its impact. Historians are well aware that while the word blend infodemic was new in 2003, the underlying concept that uncertain and misleading information can make epidemics work was definitely not. Every epidemic of the past has produced improbable facts, confusing rumors, and conspiracy theories. Check out Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year about the 1665 outbreak of the bubonic plague in London, and you'll find fake news and crazy cures aplenty. Those of us over the age of 50 do not need to go that far back. We lived through the early years of the global HIV/AIDS pandemic, which also produced a plague of misinformation that led to cruel discrimination, bogus cures, and destructive conspiracy theories. In a 1988 article about the AIDS epidemic, the journalist Ellen Goodman reached conclusions strikingly similar to those of David Rothkopf in his 2003 piece on SARS. She wrote, "Misinformation is highly infectious." We can agree then that while the digital revolution may have magnified the problems of communicating during the pandemic, it certainly did not create them. So how then do we make sense of that change over time and its consequences? That's what I want to think with you about today. I'm going to first discuss some of the terminology used in the current discussion of COVID, and then do a brief comparative review of the misinformation problem during the early HIV/AIDS pandemic. In other words, before the rise of the internet, and then compare that to COVID after the internet. I've also done this kind of comparative thinking around the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, but AIDS really is a better tool for my purpose in this talk today. So let me just quickly, and at this point, if I could ask Una to start the slides. Okay. We can skip over that first one and the second one, and we'll go to here. Let me just explain some of the terminology. This is a nice diagram from Claire Wardle's A New World Disorder from 2019. Misinformation is unintended or natural confusion. It could be a simple mistake, or it could be a revision of facts after receiving new information, which is a common development with novel pandemics. Disinformation is a more intentional effort to sow falsehoods for personal or financial gain often. And depending on how much harm you do with it, it can go into the malicious category and become malinformation. Here's another graphic from Waldrop in the PNAS. If I can have the next slide, Una. Here's a nice graphic showing you, and note again the date 2017. This had become a major area of research about fake news that has provided the foundation for understanding COVID in a lot of ways. So efforts to kind of categorize the different sorts of fake news. Now, in my reading, I've noticed how the preoccupation with deciding what's information versus misinformation and disinformation has deflected attention from the processes of gathering, measuring, and analyzing the information itself. In other words, exactly the kind of complex stuff that historians study. And in my efforts, in my previous work to understand the health information revolution in the late 20th century, I often noted the tendency to equate data dumps with the securing of informed consent. In other words, if I put all the raw data out there, you'll be able to figure it out and make a good decision. In the advent of big data, machine learning, algorithms, and complex modeling, makes it all the more important that we think about the product, what goes into the process of creating the information. And in fairness, I think scholars engaged in the study of digital communication are very aware of that complexity. If I can have the next slide. This is another commonly used graphic model that dates back to the 1970s, in the beginnings of the computer revolution, attempting to qualify the differences among data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. wisdom is a word I kind of stumble over. Maybe insight would be better at the top there, but you can see what they're trying to model out here. So simply having the data doesn't mean that you can interpret it in a correct way or even the same way as somebody else looking at that same data. Finally, I wanted to briefly include denialism, again, as another very commonly used word in discussing AIDS. If I could have the next slide, Una. This is, again, a well-known graphic coming out of the environmental science movement. In recent years, scholars have been calling out the similarities in techniques used by various movements that want to deny something. It can be the Holocaust, it can be the dangers of using tobacco products, it can be the role of HIV in causing AIDS, and last but not least, climate change. So this is a nice graphic developed by the climate activist John Cook that the flick, fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. Now, what many of these models lead us to assume is that when faced with a new public health threat, it's going to be normal to have an initial period of confusion and denial. But once the scientific consensus settles, refusal to accept the facts then becomes maladaptive and ultimately malignant. And the measure of harm in these kinds of the damage done by refusal to accept the truth is often measured in guesstimates about the number of lives that might have been saved if a deliberate disinformation campaign had not taken place. Now, just having me walk you through this, to me, incredibly interesting way of thinking about what we're going through. It's very interesting, but it also leads to a lot of questions about, well, who decides when it's misinformation and when it's disinformation? And I anticipate there'll be some interesting questions about that in the Q&A. But let me try to use some of these basic concepts to do a compare and contrast between early HIV/AIDS and later COVID in the United States. And it'll be interesting to see if there are differences with the Scottish situation, again, in the Q&A. So the AIDS pandemic is a good point of comparison for me. It's now portrayed as the first of a new series of emerging infectious diseases. Its deadly spread across the world inspired new interest in public health preparedness planning at both the national and the international level. It also inspired a torrent of misinformation, disinformation, and denialism that went viral before there was the internet. Let me just give you a brief American flavored summary of the pandemic. As you may remember, the Centers for Disease Control received the first reports of this puzzling, deadly new disease in 1981. Virologists quickly worked to isolate the cause, which was identified in 1984 as a retrovirus. With the development of the ELISA test, they were able to clarify the virus's mechanisms of spread through the exchange of semen and blood during sex, IV drug use, and blood transfusions. In retrospect, the speed with which this consensus emerged is impressive. Yet the AIDS pandemic inspired a robust cycle of misinformation and disinformation. Some of that misinformation had to do with the normal churn of scientific discovery. As new information became available, experts revised their previous views. For example, GRID, gay-related immune disorder, became AIDS. Stigma and bias also formed major obstacles to rolling out information about cause and prevention. Those perceived most at risk from AIDS did not trust public health authorities. Newly liberated gay men were not eager to get stuffed back into the closet. Black communities concerned about IV drug abuse were resistant to harm reduction in the form of needle exchange. Those least at danger least at risk from AIDS did not believe they were safe. Many felt a terror of casual contact that caused rampant discrimination and shunning of people with HIV. Una, if you could show the next slide. In fact, the AIDS epidemic was a direct influence on my writing of the Gospel of Germs, because I was so struck by how people were using habits that they had been taught that were developed to combat cholera and tuberculosis, but were applying them in unuseful ways to HIV AIDS. And this is a well-known public health ad from 1987, basically showing that's all the Gospel of Germs in those four images were common as to avoid casual contact, but not what was going to protect you against HIV. The existing mistrust of public health expertise greatly complicated preventive health education during HIV/AIDS. It probably resulted in higher death tolls than had to be, but it did lead to an important recognition in public health work about the importance of trust. And if the sound information you present is not delivered by a person who has the trust of the community, it's not going to be listened to. But once that message was put into the hands of community leaders in the groups at risk, it was possible to get the message across and to slow transmission. And that tactic was effectively used by gay activists. Una, if I can see the next slide. This is some of the early AIDS brochures developed by gay activists in San Francisco. And the next slide, a similar kind of outreach. Next slide. Yes, you can see it has less money behind it, but still very effective. As a Philadelphia-based Black community group, Babashi, that did some of really pioneering work in AIDS education in Black neighborhoods. One of the prime lessons of HIV/AIDS that my generation learned, and that later became a bedrock assumption about public health education and risk communication, was that you needed to get it into the hands of the community, use intermediaries, use trusted leaders, or in a more digital age, language influencers. But what I want to point out to you is that the most successful forms of AIDS outreach did not involve digital forms of media. It was a lot of old school, low cost methodologies, posters, pamphlets, and outreach of actual human beings. Where in fact was the media in all of this? The AIDS epidemic occurred at a time of significant media upheaval, as cable television was challenging the old broadcast system, and the 24 news cycle was just beginning. CNN started in 1980. Programming and marketing to mass audiences was being replaced by a new attention to cultivating audiences in media markets and tastes, more specialized markets. You might think that this would translate into swift and extensive media coverage of AIDS, but in fact, that was not the case. For the 1980s was also an era of growing political conservatism. Ronald Reagan got elected in 1980 and re-elected in 1984 with the help of the so-called moral majority. The emerging scientific consensus about AIDS helped cement the emerging alliance between old line, often Roman Catholic conservatives and white evangelicals around the belief that AIDS was God's punishment on gay people and IV drug users. The conservative talk show host Rush Limbaugh got his start in popularity using AIDS to prime his career. Ronald Reagan did not use his powers as president to mobilize action against AIDS. He did not even say the word in public until 1985 and did not give a speech on AIDS until 1987. Only slowly did mainstream print and electronic journalism break their silence. That coverage remained very one-sided in its focus on a gay plague, showing far less interest in AIDS as a problem in Black and Brown communities. But their less moralistic coverage about AIDS reinforced the growing sense of a division between conservative media on the one hand and liberal media outlets, a division that would continue to be elaborated after the 1980s, and a division that that Donald Trump would accentuate and widen. As you likely know, there were many conspiracy theories about HIV/AIDS, that the virus had been invented by the CIA, that it was part of a deliberate genocide against Black people. It also gave rise to an organized denialism movement, the most famous exponent of which was the UC Berkeley molecular biologist Peter Duesberg, who insisted, and still does, that there was no proof that HIV/AIDS caused AIDS. Duesberg became the leader of a diverse group of activists who distrusted the pharmaceutical industry and commercial parties wanting to promote natural alternatives to drugs like AZT, and last but not least, journalists looking for a story. And as you also likely know, these views got an international hearing in South Africa during the presidents of Thabo Mbeki. Again, note that all this AIDS denialism established its profile using old-fashioned techniques. People wrote articles and books, they gave speeches, they had meetings, and they cultivated media coverage in the traditional media of their activities. They made little use of the internet until the early 2000s. So this brings me to the key question. How did the arrival of new information technologies in the early 21st century change these existing dynamics of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy thinking, and denialism? This is a research question many of us are actively tackling now, and I can give you some just very preliminary insights. Clearly, the shift from the static Web 1.0 to the more interactive Web 2.0 is critical. With the old web, people clicked on a website but did not contribute to its content. It was a passive experience. With Web 2.0, the user became a content creator. As with social networking sites, Facebook begins in 2004. Video sharing sites, YouTube begins in 2005. And then with the arrival of smartphones, handheld devices became portals to all kinds of interactive applications. The App Store for Apple phones opened in 2007. The founders of the World Wide Web had envisioned it as an objective tool to promote rational discourse and data sharing in the name of human progress. But this more interactive network of connections created space for the opposite, the use of social media to propagate alternative truths and cultivate informational bubbles that would be hard to penetrate. And that potential started to complicate public health responses to disease outbreaks, starting with SARS and Ebola, and later the Zika outbreaks. And so in COVID, we're really just seeing the latest example of this. As I mentioned earlier, COVID is the biggest pandemic to occur since the proliferation of all these digital devices that connect so many people. So far, that enhanced connectivity has seemed more a liability than a benefit. As Joan Donovan, director of the Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, has noted, quote, "The internet hasn't been built for a pandemic. It hasn't been built for giving timely, relevant, local, and redundant information, which is what everyone needs in this moment. The ease of producing and distributing messages has allowed the wide circulation of dubious information about risky treatments and conspiracy theories, the worst of which actually move through private circuits that even experts like Donovan cannot track, the dark web. It's like crazy on crazy, she has said of the COVID situation. These developments have understandably triggered a tidal wave of research on media and the digital harms that it can do. And we need that work for sure, but we also need to put this media revolution in a longer term perspective and to see how it has worsened climates of mistrust and politicization of public health issues that already existed. If we focus only on managing the social media, we miss the deeper infrastructure, the links among national security, inequality, politics, healthcare choice, that have already complicated public health messaging before COVID arrived. And let me try to be clear here. I am not disputing the importance of social media. And I think the work that is being done on its impact is extremely important. And I've learned a lot from reading it. The seminal work out of MIT in 2018 that showed false news travels faster. People are more likely to share it. We need to understand that. We need to understand why it's easier to get the poppycock out there. Changes in media business models, the lowered barriers of access, the absence of filters, these are all very important variables. My point is more nuanced, that we need to be more critical about the assumptions we are making. It is not just digital messages and digital harms that require our attention. Assuming that interactive social media is the cause of resistance, it obscures the reality that most people still do not get their information solely from these personal digital devices. This is especially true of older people and people of color, and everybody who's on the other side of the digital divide that does not have 24/7 access to the internet. Studies, in fact, looking at how people are processing COVID information suggest that they are taking in a range of information, and a lot of it includes the old media. TV and radio are still important influences, and also word of mouth, sources that are not being mediated by Facebook. The water cooler conversation with a colleague or the chat with a family doctor. In fact, if you go beyond the clickbait stories about the latest bizarre posting by a self-appointed COVID denier, you'll find some good news that suggests that many people have not gotten lost in the social media funhouse. Rates of fact-checking, for example, are way up. It may take people a while, but they have found their way to more reliable sources of information if they are looking for them. The majority are not pushing out what they clearly perceive to be misinformation. In some ways, you could argue that the system of information sharing has not worked so badly. This is the glass half full argument. It is the minority of COVID deniers who are leading the public resistance and partisan political efforts to hamstring social distancing and vaccination. Una, if we could see the next slide. This is from a playground in Queens. It's oversimplistic to see this COVID resistance just as a social media problem. In fact, the dynamic interchanges between old and new media are a key to its power. In my country, Fox News and the New York Post are prime spreaders of COVID misinformation, and they are not new media. Too exclusive a focus only on the digital end of things and the digital harms, I think, misses that vital connection. It is this determined minority that gets the media attention, creating an infodemic about the infodemic, as one commentator recently put it. Now, again, don't get me wrong. I think we need to be studying what's going on with these resistors. And if we could see the next couple of slides. This is a really prominent phenomena in the United States. We could see the next one. The intersection between libertarian and anti-vaccination movement is truly significant. But in my opinion, trying to increase the scientific literacy of these folks is an absolute waste of time. I think the more heavy-handed approach that's increasingly used of shutting down their easy access to social media is warranted, although very, very difficult. So what are my takeaway points? I would say we need to broaden our problem solving beyond a too exclusive focus on digital media and the digital harms they create. We need to invest more in person-to-person public health outreach to community influencers and not just rely on AI surveillance of what's being said on Facebook. We need to shift from simply monitoring information that may do this harm to improving the infrastructure of protection against those harms. If I could see the next slide. I'll just say, next slide, Una. That in the United States, there is a small minority of people wreaking havoc by their in-person disruptions of school board meetings and also of healthcare facilities. These are just some of the protests that pitted COVID deniers against healthcare workers. In this country, healthcare workers are being assaulted by angry COVID deniers. Workers in big box stores and restaurants are being assaulted by angry COVID deniers. We need to think about protecting them in real time. I'd also like to see more investment in strategies to protect frontline workers. I'm sorry, I'd like to see more investment in those strategies than in tinkering with the algorithms to track misinformation. I'd also like to see as much investment in building bridges of trust with community leaders and community organizations as we put into the IT infrastructure. And this needs to be done before the next crisis comes along. One of the lines in the WHO guidance document on epidemic management that I especially like says, a disaster is not time to be handing out business cards. But that investment in making those connections, we need to do more of it. The lessons of the early AIDS pandemic are worth revisiting here. It was the combination of educational outreach and community networking that got the job done. Old-fashioned forms of outreach, people going door to door to convince those hesitant to get the COVID vaccine, that's been working, as well as a very old-fashioned form of coercion. In other words, your boss tells you you're fired if you don't go and get vaccinated. It's a combination of measures that we need to be thinking about here. It's tempting to get just totally obsessed with the social media side of it or the lunacy of the latest post, but we can't lose our eye on these broader issues. Let me end with a plea to my scientist colleagues, and that is to think twice before we respond to the pandemic of poppycock simply by saying we need more basic science so people will trust it more. The science of COVID and its control is messy and it's constantly changing. And I think saying to go spend more money on basic science without thinking about the communication is a mistake. I think we also need to address the fact that part of the reason that many people do not trust science is that they think it is controlled either by the central government, which funds a lot of it, or by the pharmaceutical companies. And despite efforts to shield scientific research from political and corporate influence, that influence does persist. The anti-vax movement has thrived on exposés of past scientific misconduct and corporate malfeasance. So here's where scientists could really help, I think, and that is in addition to asking for more funding for your basic research, support research into how those findings are understood and received, and not just on studies that that rely on artificial intelligence to take the public pulse. I will conclude there and eagerly await your questions. Una, we can skip that. Yes, skip the rest.
Well, wow, Nancy, thank you for that fascinating talk. That was amazing. Got some of the historical perspectives on challenges to public health messaging, and I'm sure it's going to stimulate quite a lot of debate. If anyone would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. It's at the bottom of your screen. If you just hover over it with your mouse, you will find it, and you can put your question in there. I'm afraid we won't be looking at the chat for the questions. And yeah, and I think we'll just have a look. Hopefully there'll be time for all questions, but if not, please, no apology. You know, we do apologize, but we will do our best to get to as many as we can. One of the chief lessons of the pandemic is an old one. How have socioeconomic factors determine health outcomes? How can we, as historians, help to get this message across, both virally, otherwise?
I wish I had a good answer to that. It's part of my extreme frustration is, as I said, are you surprised that this has happened? No, because we've seen this over and over again. But that is just not, that's not a message that I think a lot of policymakers want to hear, because that really requires social change at a level that they're not interested in. So I wish I had a better answer. I'm extremely frustrated about that. So I'd be interested in suggestions from you all about how to do that.
That'd be great. That'd be a great conversation to have between historians. And the next question actually follows on from that. If you were giving advice regarding how historians of health and medicine might better engage with practitioners and policymakers, what hints and tips would you give, particularly as we need to also deal with the media?
Yes, I think trying to keep at it, because it can be very frustrating in the beginning. Over years of trying to become more outward facing in the work I do, I had to learn to do the 30-second soundbite, which I'm still not very good at. I had to kind of try to understand what they didn't know. It's a lot of hard work. But I think it's well worth doing. And I think there's more interest in our historical associations in trying to help us develop those skills. So here's a practical suggestion to all the historians here is, as we go back to our history organizations, I think a number of them are really trying to help us do exactly what you're suggesting needs to be done.
That's great. And again, the next question feeds on from that. How do you think the movement to try and decolonize academia could actually help facilitate the trust in science and the process of producing knowledge and, you know, getting it out there?
When I think about what we can, you know, I'm going to assume the person asking that question is someone kind of in my sphere. Mm-hmm. I think working with the community and trying to make those bridges is important for all of us to do, just as citizens. But where I think we have our work cut out with is talking to our scientific colleagues. Their level of bewilderment about this is directly related to their naivete, that all they have to do is say, but I'm a scientist, and everyone will trust them. It's almost pitiful that they simply have no conception of how deeply science is mistrusted by people, and not the crazy ones I was showing you. There are plenty of reasons for an educated person to have questions about the pharmaceutical industry's role in vaccine development and distribution in this pandemic. What a nightmare. So to kind of say, oh, you people, we should go and look at the really irrational folk without looking at our irrationality and the irrationality of our scientific elite. We've got to do that. So in a way, I think we might be better suited to do that, although I have to say at my university, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear, do you have something here that we can patent and make a lot of money on? If not, forget it. But anyway, I hope you're not listening to this.
That question also relates to the next one. We're thinking of distrust of science. How do we as historians, deal with the people who have distrust of governments and the relations with science and medicine? I mean, we can't really ignore them, but
no, yeah.
You can't go out and say you're wrong.
You've put your finger on something I think we all struggle with. There's that I think 2003, 2004 article by Bruno Latour, when he sort of says, oh, whoops, we spent all this time becoming social constructivists. But then when we want to say climate denialism is wrong, we're kind of, we can be hoist on our own petard. So for me, it's really kind of, I sometimes feel like I'm going back to, it's an idea of becoming a critical observer or consumer of scientific information, but with the assumption that in fact, I do prefer to put my faith in properly supervised, firewalled vaccine research than I do in the horse medicine. So again, that's a really good question that I think we in-house need to talk through. Paula Treichler had this book during AIDS called How to Have Theory in an Epidemic. I often think about that. How do we have critical theory in the middle of this craziness? We do need to be critical at the same time. We are in many ways on the same side with the scientific community fighting this.
Yeah, it is a bit of a conundrum. And so is the next question. How would initiatives to try and counter this spread of false information, how do we deal with that when at the same time, and particularly in America, you have to respect the right to freedom of speech?
Absolutely, yes. And again, that has been a major issue. And it does relate very well to the last question. We want to preserve freedom of speech because I don't want my freedom of speech to be taken away. On the other hand, am I upset that YouTube did what it did, taking down the websites of the dirty dozen or whatever they call them of anti-vaxxers? No, in a way, this is kind of a classic public health ethics issue of the good of the whole versus the good of the individual. I think, in fact, that's one reason we're suffering so miserably here, is that we've put so much emphasis on individuals. I mean, at the same time, we ignore real people, but this principle of individual choice and our community-based reasoning and ethics of, I need to wear a mask because it protects other people, that has really atrophied. And it's kind of finding our way back to a balance that says, you can't, I mean, it's back to the you can't yell fire in the crowded theater, that in essence is what to me, making some of this really awful stuff too available is the equivalent. But really good questions. Wow. I wish I was there and we could all go out to the pub and solve all this. But anyway, we'll keep
that would be great one day. And you were talking about the different forms of communication. How can we measure which ones are effective and which ones are not? I mean, you mentioned the educational outreach and community network and how that was successful with AIDS. But how do you measure which is successful? And also when you have to take into such different, the different demographics and gender, age, race, all that kind of.
Yes. Well, I think one of the values of machine-assisted processing is that you can start to collect it and then try to break it down to see, for example, how much of what is being tweeted or retweeted is coming from Fox News. So part of this data avalanche is giving us information that people are starting to sort through to try to figure out what's getting out there, what are people paying the most attention to, that gives us more of a framework for mapping the information landscape in ways that honor its complexity. So I think that's really important. As a methodological problem, I think the sorts of studies that people are trying to do that look at a community-based response is also very, very important. So that instead of doing these massive surveillance, of the entire country, of what people are saying on their digital devices, that you have a more targeted study in a particular community that talks to people and uses our survey and oral history capacity to say, where are you getting information? What do you think about it? That work is being done, but it's more labor intensive. It takes longer. And I don't think there's nearly as much money for that as there is for the fancy stuff of, let's have a AI solution. Just seems sexier to people handing out the money these days, unfortunately, than the old-fashioned stuff.
Yeah, that's true. The next question, well, it's a good one for those of us who are in the midst of teaching right now. Do you think more could be done to educate young people, but also the general public, about the reliability of different sources of information? Absolutely. And how to pick and choose?
Yes. And again, that's part of, I won't say the happy story, but the research that's being done on the use of fact checking, that one of the techniques I think that we're going to be using more of is, sometimes they call it pre-bunking, but it's kind of inserting the idea in someone's mind that they can't believe everything they read on the internet, and to become more critical consumers of digital information. That the very, the kind of emergency efforts along those lines, because of COVID, do seem to be working for that portion of the population that has not dug into this ideological tunnel vision, believing in the deep state and the horse medicine. I think they're lost. But the evidence would suggest that there's this body of undecided or just I haven't been paying that much attention that is reachable through our kind of educational methods.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, I think it's food for thought for all of us who are teaching right now. The next question revolves a little bit about leadership and religion, and the religious infodemic about COVID. How is that differing from the general infodemic in terms of, in your opinion, and how can we combat it? But it also relates with, the leadership, both community leadership related to religion, but also more broadly within a community, and, the role of leadership in challenging all this.
And we have sort of, in addition to free speech, we have church and state. And sort of that has also been especially a problem in the United States because, again, the church in the United States is divided. But the group that gets the most attention are the white evangelicals who've basically gone with, have formed an alliance with the Trump wing of the Republican Party. And I think they do play a very powerful role keeping their people in line. It has cult-like elements. I'm not sure that we can displace that. That I kind of see them as not reachable. So I guess I would say working through other churches, I think, is really valuable. But not putting too much energy into getting them to change their minds. They don't seem to change their minds very easily.
You know, a lost cause in some respects.
Yes.
Yep. Right. The next question moves on to a paper published in The Lancet in 2020 on hydroxychloroquine, based on the evidence from 671 hospitals. And this evidence did not exist, and the paper was later retracted. And the explanation seems to have been a rush to publish in order to maintain the foothold for science in the social media infoverse, even if the outcome is bad science. The question is, do you think this is down to the social media or down to the nature of modern science, their funders, the governments, universities, you know, the quick science?
I definitely think it's the latter. And maybe I was being too veiled in that last comment, but that is exactly what I think we need to be paying more attention to, is the way that the doing of science has created this problem as much as the social media. And I think that's actually something we're really trying to dig into in our WHO report. Is to look at, even good science is slow science. And when you have a new microorganism, it takes time to figure out what the sucker is doing and how it spreads. But then you put on top of it this rush. They lifted the filters that normally would have had more external review because this was so important. And that is a classic case of where the science itself created the misinformation. And if you only look at TikTok or whatever, or the crazy folks on social media, you can just ignore that. And I think there is a kind of some people who would just rather not look at that side of the equation. That is not me. I think that's really a critical issue that we need to look at. And again, where I think historians have a lot of useful knowledge to provide.
Yes, thank you. And the next question is moving more to almost comparison or draw out some of the differences between Britain and the US. This person has been surprised that they've only had one letter through their door about COVID from the UK government, which was right at the beginning of the pandemic and was in English. Maybe we haven't received letters or flyers, which other people have, but do people who refuse to follow the instructions just throw them in the bin? And is that why they haven't been used more? And is it because of the limitations of reaching the non-English speaking community?
Yes. Yeah.
And how is the US, and the question really is, has information by good old-fashioned post been used in the US? Is it different languages?
Good question. Yeah. I have not, I've gotten nothing in my post. I think back to, I'm old enough that I got the US Surgeon General's pamphlet about AIDS back in the 1980s. That was a really big deal. He sent it out on the sly. Reagan didn't want him to, but he got it out the door. But I haven't seen a paper at all. And in a way, what we get more are visuals out in public. So posters, we're getting a lot of public service messages, but not a lot of print-based notices like that. The question you're raising about the language, I think, is also a critical one. I mean, there is an effort to get in the US Spanish versions of the public service ads and posters out there. But boy, there are a lot more languages that people speak, say, in a city like New York than just Spanish. So I think that's another case where, you know, if we're assuming everybody is getting their digital information in English, we're making a big mistake, because there's all kinds of stuff circulating in other languages as well that we need to be listening to. So a good question.
And do you think governments are, following up from that, do you think governments are missing a trick not using the old-fashioned paper through the door in different languages?
Probably not, because I think the paper, well, maybe this has to do with just what has happened to our mail service in the United States. It's just basically a ghost of its former self. So I think that probably if you're going to go print-based in this country, it's more in terms of trying to get more messages into print-based news media that some people still read. But gosh, I think maybe this is a case where going to other forms of media rather than back to the old-fashioned flyer through the door may make more sense.
The next question switches direction a little bit. Your fantastic talk spoke directly to public policymakers. Why do you think the dynamics and behaviors that continue to disregard intersectional inequalities in public policy persist? And how can we better combine political science and historical analysis from the academy to try and break through to better policy decisions and outcomes?
You know, I hate to be cynical, but I think the resistance comes from the wealthy influencers in the corporate world who essentially have their thumbs on the politicians. So we're watching in the United States the battle over the human infrastructure bill. It's basically a massive rollout of pharmaceutical company lobbying and other corporate enterprises who don't want to pay the taxes to address the infrastructure and inequality issues. So I think it's at base a political problem, and it fits very well with the huge body of research and history, sociology, political science, you name it, about the kind of monetarization and corporatization of big science. Oh gosh, Susan Lindy's book, The Fog of War. Wow. It, just very powerful about, when you look at who's funding science in the United States, it's not the federal government, it's the pharmaceutical industry. So should it surprise us that people think that governments have something to do with vaccine development? But again, this kind of goes back to the earlier thing about we're critical of that, but that's a criticism that is very unpopular. It's very unpopular in my university to talk about that because they're too busy trying to get money from the federal government and the pharmaceutical companies. So we're in a pickle. I think there's no two ways about it.
Yeah, we certainly are. And the next question is confounding the pickle, so to speak. It's again moving back to the comparison and the differences between Britain and America. And this person is wondering, are the communities where there's a more social healthcare system, do you think they're more likely to look to the public health authorities for information than elsewhere?
I think so. You know what just popped into my head when you asked that question? is that I was so struck reading about the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa in 2014, 2015, of the full court press that both the international and the national and the local healthcare experts put into reaching out to the community and getting the information about Ebola into their hands. And it was a really, a lot of intensive effort directed at people. When I read about that, I thought to myself, we would never do so. It's in some ways, I think, in a developing country, you might get the experts to realize the importance of this human outreach and the use of social leaders. Somehow in the developed world, we deal in this model of individuals and not the community, and sort of appeal to the rational individual. This is really on shaky ground. But we're so individualistic, and it goes back to we're so hooked into free choice, my freedom to do what I want, that those more social community-based responses have shriveled. And in some ways, I think it's making it harder for us to deal with COVID than even it was with HIV/AIDS. That shriveling in of a more communal, a sense of being in a community. I don't know.
No, it is a difficult question. And a final question, because of the sake of time. The UK has drafted an online safety bill in 2021. Would an approach that does not criminalize language, but rather regulates and controls platform content be a more holistic approach to the spread of misinformation?
I'm not sure what the criminalization would be, because I have come to be convinced that content management and seeing that as a legitimate exercise of public health power done with great care is definitely where I think we need to go. I'm not sure about the criminalization, making it a crime to spread misinformation. I don't know that anybody has tried that route.
Yeah, it's right. I think they're talking more about, regulating and controlling the language and platform content so that it's not offensive to people and that type of thing. I think.
I do think that makes more sense as long as you have a very diverse and culturally diverse body looking at what's offensive. So it's not just what's offensive to a conservative MP. It's what would be offensive to a good Scottish citizen. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much. There are many more questions here, and I'm sorry to those of you who asked that we didn't have time to get to them, but don't worry, they will be fed back to Nancy after the event, and I'm sure she will think about them and it will help inform her research as it goes forward. And I'm sure we're all really looking forward to hearing more about this project. It's absolutely fascinating, and your take homes about, the needs for broader problem solving, beyond looking at the digital media, how we can't really monitor information, but we need to, improve some of the forms of protection, and the importance of the educational outreach and our role as in academia, but also the role of community networks. It's going to be fascinating take home, and I'm sure it's going to inspire many conversations, both in the classroom and amongst us as historians. I just wish we could take you out
to
the pub to continue the conversation. to talk about more ideas of what we as historians, as educators can do, and the many other disciplines that might also be represented here to all feed into it. So thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.